You are not lost, even though everything inside you feels disoriented. You are walking through a season where meaning has withdrawn from familiar shapes. The life you built still stands, yet it no longer shelters you. The words people speak reach your ears, but do not reach your center. Ambitions that once drove you now feel like borrowed clothing, hanging loosely from a body that has changed. You are tired in a way that sleep cannot repair. This is not exhaustion of the body, it is exhaustion of pretending. According to Carl Jung, when the psyche reaches the limit of falseness, the soul intervenes. It does not shout. It withdraws vitality. It drains meaning from the old, so that the new may be born. What you call confusion is not failure. It is timing. And this moment you are in is not random. It is a summons. There is a moment so quiet it almost escapes notice. No disaster announces it. No external loss demands attention. Life continues to look orderly from the outside. You wake in the same room, follow the same routines, fulfill the same obligations. Yet something irreversible has occurred beneath the surface. A subtle rupture has formed in the inner structure that once held everything together. You realize, without drama and without explanation, that you cannot continue living this way. This realization does not arrive as panic. It arrives as a dull certainty, a sober knowing that no amount of discipline, achievement, or endurance will restore what has gone missing. You feel it in the body before you understand it in the mind. A heaviness in the chest, a resistance to tasks that once felt manageable, a strange fatigue that sleep cannot cure. You are still functioning, still capable, still admired perhaps, but the life moving through you has thinned. What once felt meaningful now feels hollow, as if you are inhabiting a structure that no longer belongs to you. This is the true beginning. According to Carl Jung, this stage marks the first movement of individuation, when the soul refuses to remain imprisoned within a form that no longer reflects its truth. What begins to fracture here is the persona, the psychological mask you built to survive, to be accepted, to be valued. This mask was not a mistake. It was an intelligent adaptation. It allowed you to belong, to succeed, to be recognized as reliable, strong, composed. For a long time it protected you, but protection has an expiration date. As your inner life grows, the persona becomes too small. What once sheltered now suffocates. The shell begins to crack, not because you are weak, but because something within you has grown beyond the confines of who you were required to be. One part of you clings desperately to the known identity, the one who holds everything together, who does not complain, who remains functional regardless of cost. That part fears dissolution, fears judgment, fears the loss of control. It whispers that endurance is virtue, and that discomfort means failure. Another part of you, quieter but more ancient, asks for something radically different. It doesn't ask for success or recognition. It asks only to breathe, to live without constant self-surveillance, to exist without performance. This part has been patient. It has waited through years of adaptation, compromise, and self-denial. Now it presses gently but persistently against the walls of the life you have built. The conflict between these two parts creates the inner crack. At first, you may interpret this crack as depression, boredom, or ingratitude. You may scold yourself for feeling dissatisfied when nothing appears wrong. But this misinterpretation deepens the pain. The soul does not fracture to be medicated back into silence. It fractures because silence has become unbearable. What feels like meaninglessness is not the absence of purpose, but the withdrawal of borrowed meaning. The psyche is reclaiming its authority. The counterintuitive truth is this: the crack is not danger. It is intelligence. In nature, a seed does not break apart because it has failed. It breaks because life within it has reached a threshold. From the outside, the rupture looks like destruction. From the inside, it is the first act of creation. The shell must split, or the seed will rot in darkness. The same law governs the soul. When the inner life evolves beyond the structures that once contained it, pressure becomes inevitable. This stage often arrives without guidance or validation. The world continues to reward the persona. Others may praise your strength, your reliability, your composure. This praise deepens the split. You are affirmed for what no longer represents you. The more you are admired for the mask, the more alienated you feel from yourself. This alienation is not a moral failing. It is a psychological signal that the inner and outer lives have diverged too far. You may notice an increasing resistance to roles you once inhabited easily. Conversations feel repetitive. Goals feel inherited rather than chosen. You may feel an urge to withdraw, not out of bitterness, but out of exhaustion. This withdrawal is not regression. It is conservation. The psyche is redirecting energy away from maintenance and toward transformation. Jung understood that consciousness does not expand through comfort. It expands through tension. When the persona begins to crack, tension arises between who you have been and who you are becoming. This tension feels disorienting because it removes the familiar reference points. You are no longer fully identified with the old self, but you do not yet know the new one. This in-between state can feel frightening, empty, even shameful. But it is necessary. What makes this stage especially difficult is its subtlety. There is no external justification for your inner unrest. You may attempt to repair the crack by changing surface conditions, new routines, new distractions, new achievements, new relationships. These efforts may bring temporary relief, but the crack persists. It widens quietly because the issue is not circumstance, it is alignment. When life feels meaningless without obvious cause, meaning is being relocated inward. This relocation requires that you stop using the outer world as proof of your worth. It requires that you listen to discomfort without immediately numbing it. It requires patience with uncertainty. The soul does not reveal its next form on command. It reveals itself gradually, once the old form has been allowed to loosen. The cracking of the shell is not an invitation to destroy your life impulsively. It is an invitation to stop pretending that what no longer fits still does. It asks for honesty before action, attention before resolution, presence before explanation. If you are here in this quiet rupture, you are not late, you are not broken, you are not ungrateful. You are at the precise moment when growth becomes unavoidable. The shell is cracking because life within you insists on continuing. And once this process begins, it cannot be undone. You can only decide whether you will resist it or allow it to unfold with awareness. This is not the end of stability. It is the end of false stability. And in its place, something more demanding, more alive, and more truthful is beginning to take shape. When the call of the soul is ignored long enough, pain arrives. Not suddenly, not violently, but with a quiet inevitability. It does not come as punishment. It comes as insistence. The psyche has exhausted gentler methods. The silence was not heard. The signals were dismissed. And so suffering enters as the final language the soul can use when all others have failed. At first, you attempt to manage it the way you have managed everything else. You distract yourself. You stay busy. You reason your way through the discomfort. But the old distractions no longer work. The activities that once soothed you feel empty. The pleasures that once relieved tension feel dull. The mind runs out of places to hide. You are forced into contact with what you have avoided for years. Grief rises without asking permission, not always tied to a single loss, but to a lifetime of unacknowledged endings. Anger surfaces, sharp and unfamiliar, directed not outward, but inward, toward all the moments you silenced yourself to maintain peace. Fear emerges without a clear object, a deep existential fear that has nothing to do with circumstances and everything to do with identity. These emotions do not negotiate. They do not soften to spare you. They insist on being felt. This is where many people believe something has gone wrong. But Carl Jung understood suffering differently. He saw it not as an error in the system, but as a threshold, a necessary passage between an old orientation to life and a deeper one. Jung wrote that neurosis is often a substitute for legitimate suffering. When pain is avoided, suppressed, or medicated into silence, it does not disappear. It reorganizes itself into anxiety, depression, compulsions, or chronic dissatisfaction. The psyche will suffer one way or another. The only choice is whether the suffering will be conscious or unconscious. Pain faced consciously becomes transformation. Pain avoided becomes pathology. This truth is deeply unsettling because it dismantles the modern promise that suffering is optional. You were taught that something is wrong if you feel pain, that emotional discomfort is a malfunction to be fixed as quickly as possible. But the soul does not evolve through comfort. It evolves through confrontation with what is real. The counterintuitive truth is this: suffering does not shrink you, it reveals you. Suffering strips away pretense. It removes the energy that once supported false identities. You can no longer maintain the illusion of strength, control, or perpetual composure. The structures you relied on begin to collapse, not because you are incapable, but because they were never meant to carry the full weight of your becoming. In nature, fire is not only destructive, it is selective. It burns away what is dry, brittle, and lifeless, leaving behind what is essential and resilient. Forests that never burn eventually choke themselves with decay. New growth requires clearing. Pain functions the same way in the psyche. It burns through outdated beliefs, inherited expectations, and internalized rules that once ensured survival, but now obstruct truth. During this stage, you may feel weak in a way that frightens you. Your usual confidence falters. Your capacity to endure without complaint diminishes. You may feel exposed, fragile, uncertain of who you are becoming. This weakness is not regression. It is honesty. For the first time, you are no longer propping yourself up with false strength. Honesty is painful because it removes insulation. You feel everything more acutely. The world seems sharper. Your own inner landscape feels raw and unprotected. Yet this exposure is not cruelty. It is intimacy with reality. You are encountering yourself without armor. Jung believed that wholeness is not achieved by eliminating darkness, but by integrating it. Suffering forces this integration because it collapses the division between what you present to the world and what you carry within. The parts of you that were exiled for the sake of functionality return, not gently, but truthfully. They demand acknowledgement judgment, not correction. This is also why suffering often arrives when life appears externally stable. When survival is no longer the primary concern, the psyche turns toward meaning. What once worked is no longer sufficient. The soul demands depth where you have been offering efficiency, presence where you have been offering performance. There is a particular loneliness in this stage, because suffering isolates you from those who have not yet crossed this threshold. Advice feels shallow, reassurances ring hollow. You are no longer looking for solutions. You are being reshaped. And reshaping is not a process that can be rushed or outsourced. Yet even here, suffering is precise. It does not attack randomly. It targets what is false. It dismantles what cannot accompany you further. If you observe carefully, you will notice that what is being stripped away is not your essence, but your adaptations. The pain is not asking you to become someone new. It is forcing you to stop being someone you are not. In metallurgy, ore is subjected to extreme heat, not to destroy it, but to separate what is valuable from what is not. The process looks violent. The material appears to be breaking down. But what emerges is purer, stronger, and more capable of bearing weight. The psyche undergoes a similar refinement. Suffering applies pressure where growth is possible. If you can remain present here, without numbing or dramatizing the pain, something remarkable begins to occur. The suffering changes quality. What was overwhelming becomes informative. You begin to recognize patterns. You see how certain pains repeat because certain truths were never honored. You see how avoidance created complexity and honesty simplifies. This does not mean the pain vanishes. It means it becomes meaningful. The truth about suffering is not that it makes you special. It is that it makes you real. It dismantles the life you are performing, so the life you are meant to live can begin to take shape. And while this process feels like loss, it is in fact a narrowing toward what matters. Suffering is not the enemy of awakening. It is its gatekeeper. After the shell cracks, silence enters your life with an unfamiliar weight. It is not the quiet of rest or relief. It is a hollow stillness, wide and unsettling, like standing alone in a field after the wind has stopped. The usual inner noise recedes. The constant urgency that once propelled you forward loses its grip. You continue to function, to fulfill obligations, to move through the hours of the day, yet something essential feels missing. You are present in form, but absent in essence. This silence confuses you because it does not behave like emptiness, as you were taught to understand it. There is no obvious despair, no dramatic sadness to point to. Instead, there is a dull disconnection, a sense of living slightly to the side of your own life. Fatigue settles into the body without physical cause. Sleep no longer restores you. You wake already tired, as if the night carried messages you cannot fully remember. Dreams become vivid, symbolic, sometimes unsettling. Images linger with emotional residue long after you open your eyes. At the same time, the outer world begins to behave strangely. Coincidences appear that feel too precise to dismiss. A book falls into your hands at the exact moment a question forms within you. A sentence overheard in passing echoes something you have been struggling to articulate. You encounter themes, symbols, or ideas repeatedly, as if reality itself is circling the same point. You feel watched over and unsettled at once. According to Carl Jung, this is the uprising of the unconscious. When the conscious mind has exhausted its strategies, the deeper psyche begins to surface. But it does not speak in clear instructions or rational rational explanations. It speaks in sensations, moods, images, and synchronicities. It communicates through atmosphere rather than argument, through feeling rather than thought. This is why the silence feels so disorienting. You are accustomed to meaning arriving through words, plans, and logic. Now meaning withdraws from those channels. The soul is asking for a different kind of attention, one that listens without demanding immediate clarity, one that can tolerate not knowing. The counterintuitive truth is this: what feels like disconnection is actually a call to deeper connection. The psyche has not gone quiet because it is empty. It has gone quiet because it is reorganizing. The old internal dialogue, shaped by obligation, ambition, and fear, has been muted so a deeper voice can be heard. But this deeper voice does not compete with noise. It waits for it to subside. In nature, winter does not announce its purpose. It arrives as barrenness. Trees stand stripped of leaves, their branches exposed and seemingly lifeless. From the outside, growth appears to have stopped. But beneath the frozen ground, roots are strengthening, redistributing energy, preparing for a form that cannot yet be seen. What looks like stagnation is preparation. What looks like death is restraint. So it is with you. This silence is not asking you to fix anything. It is asking you to remain. To resist the impulse to immediately fill the emptiness with distraction, productivity, or explanation. You may feel tempted to return to old habits simply to feel something again. To reattach yourself to familiar roles, relationships, or routines that once gave you identity. But each time you do, the silence returns, deeper and more insistent. That insistence is not cruelty, it is precision. Jung understood that when the unconscious rises, it does so because the conscious attitude has reached its limit. The psyche cannot continue growing under the same conditions. This stage often feels like a loss of motivation, but in truth, it is a withdrawal of false motivation. What no longer aligns with your deeper nature loses its energy. What remains unresolved begins to demand attention. You may judge yourself harshly here. You may think you are becoming lazy, ungrateful, or indifferent. But this judgment comes from an outdated standard. The soul is not interested in efficiency. It is interested in truth. And truth often requires stillness before movement. This is also why emotions during this phase feel muted or confusing. You may not feel intensely sad or intensely joyful. You may feel suspended between states, as if waiting for something unnamed. This suspension is not paralysis. It is incubation. The psyche is creating space for new meaning to emerge without being immediately categorized or controlled. Synchronicities intensify during this stage because the boundary between inner and outer worlds becomes thinner. Jung described synchronicity as meaningful coincidence, the alignment of inner state and outer event. When you are no longer fully identified with your conscious persona, the deeper patterns of the psyche find reflection in the external world. These moments are not meant to be decoded obsessively. They are meant to be noticed. They remind you that you are not isolated within your suffering. You are participating in a larger order, even if you cannot yet see its shape. If you are patient here, something begins to shift. The silence changes texture. What was hollow becomes spacious. What felt like absence begins to feel like depth. You start to sense that the quiet is not empty, but full of something forming slowly, deliberately, without urgency. This stage teaches you a difficult discipline: to trust what is invisible, to honor processes that do not yield immediate results. forcing resolution. The soul does not reveal itself to those who rush. It reveals itself to those who can stay present without certainty. When the soul speaks through silence, it is not asking you to understand. It is asking you to listen. And listening, in this sense, is not an action. It is a posture, a willingness to remain open while old meanings dissolve and new ones have not yet taken form. This silence is not the absence of life. It is life gathering itself. After pain has done its precise and unforgiving work, something irreversible occurs. Conformity becomes unbearable. What once felt normal now feels heavy. The rhythms you moved to without question begin to grate against your inner ear. You notice it in small moments at first. Conversations that circle endlessly without depth. Shared goals that feel rehearsed rather than lived. Ambitions that sound impressive, yet leave you strangely untouched. The noise of the crowd no longer reassures you. It suffocates you. This realization arrives without arrogance and without drama. You do not feel above others. You feel out of alignment. You begin to see that much of what you pursued was never truly chosen. It was inherited, absorbed, agreed to in silence. You followed paths because they were visible, rewarded, applauded. You learned the language of belonging and spoke it fluently, and now that language feels foreign in your mouth. Carl Jung warned that the collective has immense power over the individual psyche. It offers safety, identity, and direction, but it also exacts a price. The larger the crowd, he observed, the more easily the individual disappears into it. Awakening does not make you better than others. It makes you more distinct. And distinction is often mistaken for separation. Loneliness appears here, sharp and unexpected. You may find yourself surrounded by people and yet feel profoundly alone. Not because you are unloved, but because you are no longer living from borrowed consensus. The inner voice that once whispered is now too loud to ignore, and it speaks a language few around you understand. This loneliness is not the absence of connection. It is the absence of false connection. The counterintuitive truth is this: solitude is not exile, it is differentiation. In nature, every creature must at some point separate from the group to discover its own orientation. A bird that has flown in formation all its life does not suddenly know its individual direction the moment it leaves the flock. At first, it trembles. The air feels vast and unstructured. There is no immediate signal telling it where to go. But only in that open sky can its own navigational sense awaken. Only there can it learn what direction truly belongs to it. So, it is with you. The crowd provided rhythm and reassurance. It told you when to move, when to stop, what to desire, what to fear. Leaving it feels like stepping into uncertainty without a map. You may question yourself relentlessly during this phase. You may wonder if you are isolating unnecessarily, if you are becoming difficult, if something is wrong with you for no longer enjoying what everyone else seems to accept without struggle. But what is happening is not withdrawal from life. It is withdrawal from imitation. Jung understood individuation as the process by which a person becomes who they are, not who the collective expects them to be. This process requires separation, not in hostility, but in clarity. You cannot hear your own inner direction while marching in step with everyone else. The noise is too loud. The pace is too imposed. This stage often brings a sense of being in between worlds. You no longer belong fully to the old structures, yet you have not found new ones. The temptation here is to rush toward another group, another ideology, Another identity that promises belonging, but that would only repeat the pattern in a different form. The soul is asking for something rarer, to stand without immediate affiliation. There is a quiet parable of a man who left a bustling city to live near the mountains. At first, the silence frightened him. He missed the constant hum, the sense of being part of something larger. But as days passed, he began to hear sounds he had never noticed before. The wind shifting through trees, the subtle movements of animals, his own breath. The silence did not isolate him. It revealed a deeper participation with life. Awakening from the crowd works the same way. The absence of collective noise allows a different order to emerge. You begin to sense your own values not as concepts, but as bodily truths. You notice what drains you and what quietly nourishes you. You recognize which compromises cost too much and which solitude feels restorative rather than empty. This does not mean rejecting society or turning away from others. It means refusing to let the collective decide your worth, your pace, or your purpose. You stop measuring your life by applause or comparison. You begin measuring it by alignment. This stage requires courage because the crowd offers instant validation, while individuation offers none. There is no guarantee that your path will be understood or approved, but there is a deeper reward: coherence. The relief of no longer splitting yourself to fit expectations. The quiet strength of standing in your center without needing to defend it. You are not meant to disappear into sameness. You are meant to become distinct enough to participate consciously. Only an individual can truly relate. Only someone who knows their own direction can walk alongside others without being pulled off course. Awakening from the crowd is not the end of belonging. It is the beginning of belonging to yourself. Here you encounter the most frightening demand of all: truth. Not truth about the world, not opinions or philosophies, but truth about yourself. The kind of truth that dismantles excuses and exposes the quiet agreements you made with fear. At this threshold, there is no crowd to hide within, no role to perform convincingly. What remains is the naked encounter with who you have been pretending to be and who you are now asked to become. The false self resists with remarkable intelligence. It argues not with cruelty, but with reason. It reminds you of what you might lose if you stop adapting. It speaks of stability, reputation, harmony, and survival. It warns you that honesty could cost you belonging, comfort, or love. These warnings are not lies. They are memories. They come from earlier seasons of life when truth did carry danger. And so the false self clings to habit as if habit were safety. But this is the moment when habit becomes the prison. Carl Jung called this confrontation the psychic leap. It is not a gradual adjustment. It is an inner decision. A line crossed in consciousness where you can no longer pretend that adaptation is the same as integrity. You realize that much of your life has been organized around being acceptable rather than being real. And once this realization becomes conscious, it cannot be reversed. This leap does not feel heroic. It feels terrifying. You may feel as though you are standing at the edge of a cliff without knowing what lies below. The old identity dissolves faster than the new one forms. Certainty evaporates. Familiar reference points disappear. The mind searches desperately for reassurance and finds none. This is the cost of honesty. You must step forward without guarantees. At this stage, the shadow emerges with force. The shadow is not only what you fear about yourself, but also what you were never allowed to be. Your anger, your need, your selfishness, Your longing for recognition, your tenderness, your vulnerability. You see qualities you once disowned because they threatened attachment. You also see capacities you buried because they didn't fit the version of you that was rewarded. This encounter is humbling. You realize that you are not purely noble nor purely wounded. You are complex, contradictory, capable of generosity and cruelty alike. The false self collapses here because it relies on a simplified image. The real self is not simple, it is whole. The counterintuitive truth is this: fear is not a sign to stop, it is the guardian of authenticity. Fear appears precisely where truth threatens to replace illusion. It rises at the boundary between who you were and who you must become. If you interpret fear as a warning of danger, you will retreat into the familiar. If you recognize fear as a threshold marker, you will understand that you are close to something essential. In nature, the moment of greatest vulnerability often precedes transformation. The caterpillar dissolves inside the cocoon before becoming the butterfly. There is a stage where form collapses entirely. If you could witness it, you would think life had ended. But this dissolution is not failure. It is reorganization at a deeper level. So it is with you. The leap from pretending to being real requires that you release the lower ledge before you can grasp the higher one. There is a moment where you are held by nothing but your own presence. No external validation, no familiar identity, only the raw experience of standing in truth without armor. This leap does not demand perfection. It demands sincerity. You do not have to become better. You have to become honest. Honest about what drains you. Honest about what you want. Honest about where you have been silent to avoid conflict. Honest about the cost of maintaining peace at the expense of yourself. As this honesty deepens, something unexpected happens within the body. The nervous system begins to reorganize. Chronic tension releases in places you did not know were braced. Breathing deepens. Sleep shifts. Energy that was locked into suppression becomes available for creativity and presence. This is not metaphorical. Living truthfully rewires the psyche and the body together. What was once held in vigilance can now move freely. You may notice that some relationships strain during this phase. Others fall away quietly. This is not because you are becoming unlovable. It is because you are becoming less negotiable. Truth has weight. It alters dynamics simply by being present. Those who relied on your compliance may resist this change. Those who can meet you in reality will remain. This stage teaches you that authenticity is not aggression, and honesty is not cruelty. You learn to speak without attack, and to stand without apology. You discover that saying no does not destroy love, but reveals whether love was real to begin with. The leap is not a single act. It is a posture you adopt again and again. Each time you choose alignment over approval, you strengthen the muscles of truth. Each time you remain present with fear rather than obey it, you reclaim a piece of yourself that was given away too early. What you are leaving behind is not security. It is pretense. What you are moving toward is not chaos. It is coherence. And coherence, once established, becomes a kind of quiet power. You no longer need to convince. You no longer need to perform. You simply stand. This is the leap that changes everything. Not because it makes life easier, but because it makes life real. At the final stage, something quietly decisive occurs. The relentless restless movement of the inner surge slows, then comes to rest. Not because every question has been answered, not because life has become simple or painless, but because the urgency itself dissolves. You realize that what drove you forward for so long was not curiosity, but a sense of lack. And now that lack no longer commands you. You stop searching not because you have arrived somewhere new, but because you recognize where you have always been. This recognition does not arrive as triumph. There is no rush of certainty, no declaration of enlightenment. It arrives as a calm settling, like dust falling after a long disturbance. You begin to inhabit your life without the constant pressure to fix it, explain it, or redeem it. You take responsibility for your choices without bitterness. You no longer need a villain to justify your pain, nor a savior to absolve you of it. You see clearly that waiting to be rescued was never humility. It was postponement. This is where adulthood of the soul truly begins. You understand now that no teacher, partner, belief, or path could ever have walked this terrain for you. Guidance mattered, encounters mattered, suffering mattered, but none of them were meant to replace your presence. They were meant to lead you back to it. Responsibility no longer feels like a burden. It feels like ground beneath your feet. You stand where you are, without resentment toward the past, and without bargaining with the future. The counterintuitive truth is this: wholeness is not achieved, it is remembered. You have been living as though something essential had been lost, stolen, or delayed, as though life owed you a final piece that would make everything make sense. This belief kept you moving, striving, hoping. But now you see that the self was never absent. It was obscured by noise, by fear, by relentless becoming. The work was never to acquire something new, but to remove what stood in the way of recognition. In nature, after a violent storm, a lake does not calm itself through effort. It does not try to be still. It simply allows the wind to pass. As the forces that agitated it withdraw, the surface settles on its own. The clarity that returns is not manufactured, it is revealed. The reflection of the sky was always possible. It only required the cessation of disturbance. So it is with you. The night does not vanish at this stage. You do not become immune to doubt, loss, or pain. But your relationship to them changes. You no longer interpret darkness as failure. You understand it as contrast, as depth, as part of the terrain of being alive. The struggle to escape the night ends, and with it, the exhaustion that once defined you. Dawn arrives quietly, not as an event, but as orientation. You begin to meet moments as they are, without demanding that they complete you. Work becomes work. Love becomes love. Solitude becomes solitude. Nothing is inflated. Nothing is diminished. Each experience is allowed to be itself. This simplicity feels profound, not because it is dramatic, but because it is honest. You notice that you no longer measure yourself constantly. Comparison loses its grip. The question of whether you are doing enough, becoming enough, being enough, fades into the background. You act where action is required. You rest where rest is needed. You speak when truth asks to be spoken. You remain silent when silence is appropriate. Life no longer feels like a test you must pass. It feels like a process you are participating in. This remembering is not nostalgia. It is integration. The parts of you that were once divided now coexist without constant negotiation. Light and shadow no longer battle for dominance. They inform each other. Strength no longer denies vulnerability. Vulnerability no longer longer undermines strength. You are not purified. You are coherent. You may look back at the earlier stages of the journey with a strange tenderness. The confusion, the pain, the loneliness, the fear. You see now that none of it was wasted. Each stage stripped away an illusion you could no longer carry. Each loss redirected you towards something more fundamental. Even the moments that felt like regression were teaching you how to remain present without control. There is a quiet gratitude that emerges here, not because everything turned out well, but because everything turned out true. When you stop searching, you do not become passive. You become responsive. You move not from desperation, but from alignment. Opportunities arise, and you meet them without clinging. Relationships form and dissolve without defining your worth. You live from the inside outward, rather than from the outside inward. The world no longer tells you who you are. You meet it as who you are. And in this way, you understand something that could not be explained to you earlier. You were never lost. You were always in motion toward this recognition. The longing that once drove you was not a sign of absence. It was a